Before I start, take just 1 second to support the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments which US city you're watching from. Don't go anywhere. What I'm about to share begins quietly, but it ends in a way no one saw coming. The day my daughter died, the world didn't stop. That was the cruelest part. Cars still passed outside the hospital. Phones still rang. A vending machine hummed somewhere down the hall, offering snacks no one wanted. Meanwhile, I sat in a molded plastic chair, staring at a doctor's mouth moving, waiting for words that might rewind time. They never came. My daughter was 32. A nurse. A single mother. Exhausted most days but proud in a way that didn't need words. She'd dropped off her 6-month-old son at my house that morning so she could pick up an extra shift. We joked about how fast he was growing. About how she'd finally sleep on her next day off. She never came back. A drunk driver ran a red light. The impact was instant, they said. No pain. As if that mattered to the people left breathing. What mattered was the car seat in the back of her vehicle. Empty. What mattered was the tiny boy sleeping in my guest room at that exact moment, unaware that the person who gave him life would never hold him again. By nightfall, I was no longer just a grieving mother. I was a decision maker. I was asked questions no one prepares you for. Who would take the baby home? Who would sign temporary guardianship papers? Did I understand what temporary might turn into if no one else stepped forward? I was 58 years old. I'd raised my children. I'd buried my husband years earlier. I'd finally begun to imagine a life where I rested. Instead, I signed my name. That night, after everyone left, after casseroles were stacked in the fridge and condolences echoed out the door, I held my grandson in the quiet. He smelled like milk and clean laundry. He fit perfectly against my chest, as if he'd always belonged there. I whispered a promise into his hair. I won't let anything happen to you. At the time, I thought that promise was about grief. About love. About survival. I had no idea it would one day be tested by someone who shared his blood, but none of the sacrifice. Because 5 years later, after I'd given up sleep, savings, and any version of myself that came first, someone would look me in the eye and reduce all of it to 4 words. You're just the babysitter. And the moment those words were spoken, everything changed. People like to say, you're so strong, when they don't know what else to say. What they really mean is, I can't imagine surviving what you did. The truth is, I didn't feel strong. I felt necessary. And necessity doesn't ask permission. The first year blurred together. Bottles at midnight. Diapers at dawn. Learning how to rock a baby with one arm while answering work emails with the other. I went back to work sooner than I should have because bills don't grieve with you. I adjusted my schedule, took fewer hours, and watched my savings shrink with quiet panic I never voiced out loud. I sold things I loved without telling anyone. Jewelry my husband gave me. A chair I'd planned to reupholster someday. Plans I'd made for myself. All of it went piece by piece, exchanged for formula, daycare deposits, pediatric copays. I told myself it was temporary. It never was. By the time my grandson learned to walk, I'd learned how to live tired. By the time he learned to talk, I'd learned how to answer questions I never expected to hear from a child so small. Where mama? The first time he asked, I froze. I wasn't ready. No book prepares you for explaining death to someone who still believes the world is permanent. I told him she was gone but loved him very much. I told him she lived in his heart now. He accepted it the way children do, simply, without negotiation, and then asked for a snack. At night, I cried where he couldn't hear me. There was no help from his father. Not once. No card on birthdays. No text. No call. I filed paperwork, left addresses open, made sure no one could ever say I kept them apart. Silence answered me every time. And his other grandmother? She didn't exist. Not in school forms. Not in emergency contacts. Not in Christmas mornings or scraped knees or bedtime stories. I didn't speak her name because there was no reason to. I assumed, wrongly, that absence was permanent. 5 years passed that way. 5 years of lunches packed before sunrise. Of parent-teacher meetings where I was the oldest person in the room. Of neighbors asking, politely at first, "Is he your son?" and then awkwardly apologizing when I corrected them. I stopped correcting people eventually. Labels didn't matter. He called me Grandma. Sometimes, when he was half asleep, he called me Mom. I never corrected that either. By age 5, he was thriving. Not spoiled. Not deprived. Just, solid. Secure. He trusted the world because someone had shown him consistency. That mattered more than money ever could. That's why the first crack in our peace felt so wrong. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, school pickup, backpacks too big for small shoulders, children spilling out like noise and energy. I was standing there, waving, when I noticed a woman watching us from across the lot. She wasn't lost. She wasn't waiting for anyone else. Her eyes stayed locked on my grandson. Then she walked straight toward us. She smiled like someone who believed she belonged there. I assumed she was another parent. Maybe a relative of a classmate. I even smiled back, polite out of habit. But when she stopped in front of us and looked my grandson up and down, something cold passed through me. "So," she said lightly, tilting her head. "This must be him." Before I could respond, before I could even ask who she was, she turned her gaze on me and delivered the sentence that would follow me into courtrooms, nightmares, and sleepless nights. "Oh," she added. "You must be the babysitter." The word hung there, small, dismissive, surgical. I felt my stomach drop, not because of the insult, but because of the certainty in her voice. As if she'd rehearsed it. As if she'd already decided who I was. Then she smiled wider and extended her hand. "I'm his real grandmother." And in that moment, standing in a crowded school parking lot with my grandson clutching my coat, I understood something with terrifying clarity. She hadn't come to visit. She had come to reclaim something she believed was hers. And she had no idea how much blood, time, and sacrifice stood in her way. I didn't correct her that day. That choice haunted me later, but at the time, it felt like the only one that protected him. My grandson was standing right there, fingers wrapped around my sleeve, watching our faces. He didn't need to see adults arguing over him like an object in a parking lot. So I smiled. Not warmly. Not genuinely. Just enough to keep the peace. "I'm his grandmother," I said calmly. She paused, just a fraction of a second too long, then laughed softly, like I'd misunderstood her. "Oh, of course," she replied. "I meant you're the one who watches him day to day. Watches him. As if love were a shift you clocked out of." She crouched in front of my grandson and spoke to him with a practiced sweetness that made my skin prickle. She told him how tall he'd gotten. How much he looked like his father. That was the first time anyone had mentioned his father to him in years. I watched his face change. That night, after he was asleep, he asked me quietly, "Do I have another grandma?" I sat on the edge of his bed, choosing every word like it might cut him if handled wrong. I told him yes, that she was related to him through his dad. I told him she hadn't been around before, but sometimes adults make late choices. I told him nothing about fear. He accepted it easily. I didn't. Within weeks, she started appearing more often. Always unannounced. Always with gifts that felt carefully calculated. Shoes that were too expensive for playgrounds. Toys that needed instructions. Books about big houses and new beginnings. She never asked about his routines. Never asked what foods he refused to eat or which nightlight he needed on to sleep. She spoke in futures, private schools, summer programs, opportunities that sounded impressive but felt distant and impersonal. And always, threaded through her words, was comparison. Children need more than love, she said once, sipping tea at my kitchen table like she belonged there. They need access. Access to what? Money? Influence? Control? She talked about her son, the father who had vanished, as if he were a misunderstood hero. He wasn't ready back then, she said. But he's changed. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I let her talk. That was my mistake, or maybe my advantage. Because while she spoke, I watched how she framed the past. How my daughter became emotional. How the disappearance became complicated. How my years of care became help. She started correcting my grandson in small ways. Grandma doesn't mean forever, she said once, smiling. Families grow and change. He began coming home quieter after visits. Asking questions that didn't sound like his. Why don't we live in a bigger house? Why don't I see my dad? She says things might be different soon. That's when I stopped pretending this was harmless. I began writing everything down. Dates. Comments. Exact phrases. I saved voicemails. I kept gift receipts. I asked teachers gently what she told them. I didn't accuse. I listened. And then, one afternoon, an envelope arrived. Heavy paper. Legal language. My name printed like a challenge. She wasn't asking to be involved anymore. She was petitioning the court. Not as a visitor. Not as support. But as someone with rights. And in the filing, I wasn't described as family. I was described as temporary. A caretaker. A stand-in. Someone whose role could end. That night, I stood in the bathroom, door locked, and cried into a towel so my grandson wouldn't hear me. Not because I feared losing him, but because I finally understood the strategy. The parking lot insult hadn't been casual. It had been a declaration. And now, the war had moved from whispers to paper. The morning after the envelope arrived, I didn't cry again. That surprised me. Instead, I felt something colder settle in, a kind of clarity that only comes when fear runs out of places to hide. I packed my grandson's lunch, walked him to school, kissed his forehead like nothing had changed. Only after the door closed behind me did I sit down at the kitchen table and open the papers properly. The language was surgical. It described my daughter's death as unfortunate. My years of care as interim responsibility. My home as adequate but limited. She, on the other hand, was described as a stable alternative presence with extended family resources. I realized then how long she'd been preparing. I took a day off work and met with a family law attorney recommended by a coworker who spoke in careful tones and didn't sugarcoat anything. He told me the truth: money talks in family court, but patterns speak louder. And abandonment leaves fingerprints. He asked for everything. So I brought everything. 5 years of school records. Medical files. Insurance documents. Therapy notes. Photos, thousands of them. Ordinary moments turned into evidence, birthday cakes, scraped knees, science projects spread across my dining table. He studied them quietly. "She's underestimating you," he said finally. "But that doesn't mean she isn't dangerous." The court granted temporary supervised visitation. That's when the pressure increased. She started contacting the school directly. Asking for records she wasn't entitled to. introducing herself as someone who would soon be more involved. Teachers began asking me questions with cautious voices. I answered calmly. I always had receipts. Then came the phone calls. Always polite. Always edged with suggestion. "You've done so much," she said once. "Don't you think you deserve rest?" Another time, "Children adapt faster than adults." And then, the worst one. My grandson came home one evening unusually quiet. When I asked what was wrong, he hesitated. "She said I might live with her someday," he whispered. "She said you're tired." That night, something inside me hardened permanently. I installed recording software on my phone. Legal in my state. I documented every interaction. I stopped speaking emotionally and started speaking carefully. Then, late one night, unable to sleep, I searched her name online. I didn't expect much. What I found changed everything. Old civil filings. Financial disputes tied to trusts. A withdrawn restraining order involving her son, my grandson's father. A sealed custody matter from years earlier. Patterns that pointed not to care, but to control. I requested documents through legal channels. Weeks passed. When they arrived, I understood the real stakes. If her son resurfaced legally, if custody shifted, certain financial questions would reopen. Trusts dissolved. Settlements questioned. Money that had quietly changed hands after my daughter's death would suddenly require explanation. My grandson wasn't her goal. He was her shield. And now that I knew that, I stopped reacting. I started planning. After you realize someone isn't fighting fair, you have two choices. You can confront them, and give them exactly the chaos they're hoping for. Or you can step back, soften your voice, and let them believe you're tired. I chose the second. When her lawyer suggested expanding visitation, I didn't object. I asked questions. I requested structure. I used words like collaboration and what's best for the child. My attorney stayed CC'd on every email, but my tone never changed. She mistook calm for weakness. Visits increased. Always supervised. Always documented. And every time she left my house, she left a little more of herself behind. She talked when she felt safe. She talked about how expensive attorneys were. About how unfortunate it would be if old misunderstandings resurfaced. About how families needed to present a united front to courts. Once, while my grandson was coloring at the table, she said quietly, "If things shift, certain financial protections could be restored." Protections. That word stayed with me. I began recording every conversation. I asked open-ended questions and let silence do the work. People reveal the most when they're trying to sound reasonable. She began speaking about my daughter in past tense with a distance that felt rehearsed. About her son with excuses already prepared. About my role as something that had served its purpose. Then she pushed for a meeting. Not court. Not mediation. A private sit-down with attorneys present, just to talk. My lawyer agreed, with one condition. Everything would be on record. She accepted immediately. Too quickly. In that conference room, under harsh fluorescent lights, she laid out her vision like a roadmap. Extended visitation. Shared decision-making. A gradual transition. She spoke like time belonged to her. Then my attorney asked one question. "Why has your son not paid child support or sought custody in over 5 years?" She hesitated. Just long enough. She explained it away, advice, complications, waiting for the right moment. She said too much. Her attorney frowned. That's when my lawyer placed the documents on the table. The sealed dispute. The withdrawn restraining order. The trust created in my daughter's name, and dissolved after her death. Her attorney read silently. Then again. His voice changed. You told me this was resolved. She didn't answer. The meeting ended early. 2 weeks later, her petition was withdrawn. No explanation. No apology. Just silence. But the story wasn't over yet. Because someone who loses quietly often tries one last move. When her petition was withdrawn, everyone around me assumed it was over. Friends told me to relax. Co-workers congratulated me. Even my attorney said, "This is as close to a win as these cases get." But I didn't feel relief. I felt watched. People who rely on control don't give it up easily. They retreat, reassess, and look for a softer target. And in my house, there was only one. My grandson. She didn't contact me directly. That was intentional. Instead, she reached out through channels that sounded innocent: mutual acquaintances, school events, accidental encounters. Always with plausible deniability. One afternoon, my grandson came home holding a folded piece of paper. She gave me this, he said. It was a letter. Written in careful, gentle language. Telling him how much she loved him. How adults sometimes make mistakes. How none of this was his fault. How she would always be waiting. There was no threat in the words. That was the danger. That night, he asked me if loving her meant betraying me. I sat on the floor beside him, my back against his bed, and felt something inside me crack, not loudly, but deeply. I told him love isn't limited. That no one should make him choose. And that no adult has the right to place that weight on a child's shoulders. The next morning, I forwarded the letter to my attorney. That letter became evidence. It violated the spirit of the withdrawal. It showed continued influence. Continued manipulation. And most importantly, it showed intent. The court didn't reopen the case. They closed it. Formally. Permanently. An order was issued: no further contact without written permission. No indirect communication. No school involvement. When I explained this to my grandson, he didn't cry. He just nodded and said, "Okay." That's when I realized something painful and true. Children don't need grand speeches. They need adults who choose them consistently. That night, he fell asleep faster than he had in months. And I knew, finally, that the fear no longer lived in our house. When the court order arrived, it didn't come with celebration. No music. No relief rushing in. No moment where the world suddenly felt lighter. Just silence. For years, my life had been defined by vigilance. By listening carefully to every word. By measuring tone, intention, risk. When that stopped, my body didn't know what to do with the quiet. I woke up in the middle of the night, heart racing, certain I'd missed something. Certain another envelope would be waiting in the mailbox. Certain control would try to slip back in through a crack I hadn't sealed. But nothing came. Days passed. Then weeks. My grandson slowly relaxed in ways he didn't even notice himself. He stopped hovering near me. He stopped asking who would pick him up. He started leaving his door open at night again. That's when I realized how deeply this had affected him, and how carefully he'd hidden it to protect me. The guilt hit me harder than the fear ever had. I questioned everything. Could I have handled it sooner? Could I have spared him the confusion? Was protecting him from conflict the same as shielding him from truth? There are no clean answers. What I did know was this: survival had taken everything I had. And now I had to learn how to live without armor. We rebuilt routines with intention. Not because we needed structure, but because normalcy is healing. Pancakes on Saturdays. Library trips. Quiet dinners without legal papers on the table. One evening, while we were washing dishes together, he said casually, "I like when it's just us." I smiled. But my throat tightened. Because just us had been forged in loss, fear, and fight. That night, after he went to bed, I sat alone in the living room and allowed myself to grieve properly for the first time in years. Not just my daughter, but the version of myself I'd become in survival mode. I was tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. But for the first time, the tiredness didn't feel dangerous. It felt earned. And slowly, without announcement, life began to grow around the scars instead of reopening them. Time doesn't announce itself when it passes. It shows up quietly, in pant legs that suddenly seem too short, in shoes that need replacing faster than expected, in a voice that cracks mid-sentence and pretends it didn't. One day, my grandson wasn't a little boy anymore. He was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, taller than me, asking if we had any milk left. The fear had been gone for years by then. The silence was no longer heavy. It was familiar. Comfortable. Still, I knew something was coming. On his 13th birthday, after the cake was cleared and the house settled into that soft evening quiet, he sat across from me at the table and didn't reach for his phone. He just looked at me. "Can I ask you something?" he said. I nodded. My hands were steady. My heart wasn't. Why didn't my dad want me? There it was. Not anger. Not accusation. Just curiosity layered over old absence. I didn't rush. I didn't soften the truth into something unrecognizable. I told him what mattered, that adults sometimes fail long before children ever get a chance to be loved properly. That his father's absence had nothing to do with worth. That love is shown by who stays when things are inconvenient. He listened. Really listened. Then he said, "So you stayed?" "Yes," I answered. "Every day." He nodded once. That was all he needed. Later that night, I stood in the hallway and watched him sleep. No fear, no tension, just a boy at peace. I thought of all the years spent protecting him from choices he never should have had to understand. And I realized something important. I hadn't just raised him. I had protected his ability to trust the world. Graduation days are loud by design. Applause, announcements, music echoing off gym walls that have held generations of ordinary victories. I sat among parents half my age, clutching a folded program and pretending my hands weren't shaking. When they called his name, he stood taller than I remembered him ever being. He crossed the stage with quiet confidence, not rushed, not hesitant. The kind of confidence that comes from knowing someone will be waiting when you turn around. I stood when everyone else did. But when he looked into the crowd, he looked for me. Later, in the chaos of congratulations and photos, someone asked casually, "Is he your son?" Before I could answer, he said, "She raised me." 3 words. Not babysat. Not helped. Raised. In that moment, the years collapsed into something simple and undeniable. The court papers. The fear. The manipulation. None of it mattered anymore. The story no longer belonged to them. That night, after the house was quiet again, I stood in the doorway of his childhood room. The walls were bare now. The past didn't ache the way it once had. It rested. Because justice doesn't always come as punishment. Sometimes, it comes as peace. Years after the courtroom doors closed, life became something quieter than victory. Ordinary. And I learned that ordinary is a gift. My grandson moved out eventually. College first. Then an apartment of his own. The house echoed again, but this time the silence wasn't grief, it was proof of a job completed with love. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes, I found a photo from the hospital. Me, younger. Tired. Holding a baby wrapped in a blue blanket. I remembered the promise I'd whispered that night. How small and fragile it felt at the time. I kept it. Not as a reminder of fear, but of follow-through. We don't talk about his other grandmother. Not because she won, but because she doesn't matter anymore. Power only exists where attention lives. On his last visit before starting his adult life, he hugged me longer than usual and said something that closed the circle completely. You were never temporary. And just like that, the word that once threatened to erase me lost all meaning. Some people claim titles they never earn. Others earn them quietly, in the dark, without witnesses. I wasn't just the babysitter. I was the one who stayed when staying cost everything. And in the end, that was justice.